What if everything you thought you knew about a famous life was wrong? Not misunderstood, not exaggerated, but carefully staged, layer by layer, until no one thought to ask what was underneath. Because sometimes, the most disturbing stories don't begin with a scream. They begin with silence. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. A quiet street, a gated estate, a name everyone recognizes. Rob Reiner. For decades, that name carried weight, laughter, prestige, legacy, a career built on stories that shaped generations. The kind of figure people assume lives a life already mapped out, successful, safe, predictable. But here's the question no one was asking until it was too late. What if the most important part of the story was never on camera? Because on a quiet Sunday night, behind tall hedges and locked gates at a multi-million-dollar Brentwood estate, something happened that would fracture that image forever. And depending on which version you believe, what was discovered inside that property didn't just shock investigators. It forced them to reconsider everything they thought they were looking at. Not just a crime scene, but a place with a past that refused to stay buried. Let me ask you something directly. How well do you really know the places you think are familiar? The homes you pass every day? The estates you see in aerial shots? The mansions that look pristine from the outside? Because sometimes, the truth isn't in the living room. It's not in the bedroom. It's not even in the guest house. Sometimes, it's underground. This story begins the way so many modern nightmares do, with a phone call no one ever wants to make. Emergency services responding to a situation that, at first glance, appeared unthinkable. A respected household suddenly becoming the center of flashing lights, police tape, and unanswered questions. And almost immediately, the narrative began to form. Headlines, speculation, assumptions. You've seen this before. We all have. A tragedy involving a well-known family. A rush to make sense of it. A need to assign blame, motive, clarity, fast. But here's the problem. This case never behaved the way a simple story should. Because while early attention focused on who lived where, who was home, and who wasn't, there were quiet details that didn't fit. Details that didn't make sense unless you stopped looking at the people and started looking at the property itself. The house, the estate, the ground beneath it. Brentwood is known for its privacy. High walls, long driveways, properties designed not just to impress, but to disappear. And this estate was no exception. Valued in the 8-figure range, tucked away from public view, it looked like exactly what you'd expect. Success, security, distance from chaos. But distance doesn't erase secrets. It just gives them space. Here's where the story begins to shift. According to later reports and whispered accounts, investigators noticed something early on that felt off. Not dramatic, not obvious, just subtle inconsistencies that lingered the longer they stayed on the property. Rooms that didn't line up the way floor plans suggested they should. Renovations that didn't quite match public permit records. A sense that the estate was larger than it appeared on paper. At first, those details meant nothing. They rarely do. After all, wealthy homeowners renovate all the time. Blueprints change. Records lag behind reality. None of that screams danger. Until it does. And then there was the discovery that reportedly shifted the entire emotional weight of the case. Not something found immediately. Not something obvious. Something uncovered only after someone asked the wrong question. Or maybe the right one. Who actually knew this house? Think about it. Not who visited for dinner. Not who attended parties. But who knew its hidden corners. Its quiet spaces. Its locked doors. Who knew what existed below the surface? As the investigation unfolded, attention slowly expanded beyond the main residence. To the guest house. To the surrounding structures. To areas not initially considered relevant. And that's when a second name entered the public narrative. Nick Reiner. Living on the property, but separate. Close, but not inside. A detail that would become central to early interpretations of the case, and later, deeply contested. Because proximity doesn't always equal knowledge. And separation doesn't always mean safety. But before we go any further, there's another voice in this story that matters just as much. One that reportedly changed the direction of the investigation with a single statement. Romy Reiner. According to reports, she was the one who discovered something was terribly wrong. And what she allegedly told authorities that night wasn't just emotional. It was specific. A warning. a reference to a dangerous family member, a suggestion that not everything was as it appeared, an insistence that investigators look closer. Why does that matter? Because cases don't pivot on emotion alone. They pivot on information. And when someone close to the situation points investigators in a particular direction, it raises a question we can't ignore. What did she know or believe that others didn't? At this point, the public story still seemed straightforward, tragic, horrifying, but contained, until investigators reportedly expanded their search. Not outward, downward. This is where the narrative breaks away from expectation. Because what was allegedly discovered beneath the estate wasn't part of the original focus. It wasn't highlighted in early reports. It wasn't something the public was meant to notice right away. And yet, once it was found, nothing about the case could be viewed the same way again. Let me be clear. What follows is not about graphic detail. It's not about sensational violence. It's about implication. About the idea that beneath a carefully maintained image, both personal and architectural, there may have been something hidden for years. Something sealed. Something unused. Something never meant to be discussed. Ask yourself this. Why would a private residence require hidden underground space? Why would construction records fail to reflect it clearly? And why would its existence only come to light during a moment of crisis? Those questions don't accuse anyone. They simply demand attention. Because houses don't build secrets by accident. And as this story continues, you'll start to see why some investigators allegedly describe this case not as a single event, but as a slow unraveling. A narrative where the crime scene didn't tell the whole story, where the property itself became a silent witness, and where the most unsettling discovery wasn't what happened that night, but what may have been there long before. In the next section, we're going to step away from the people for a moment and focus entirely on the place. The mansion, its history, its design, its unexplained contradictions. Because before anyone could understand what was found beneath it, they had to understand why the house never quite made sense to begin with. And once you see those details, you may never look at luxury the same way again. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the house was trying to tell the story long before anyone listened? That's the uncomfortable question investigators allegedly began circling once the initial shock wore off. Once the noise faded. Once the obvious angles were exhausted. Because when you strip away the headlines, the emotions, the assumptions about people, you're left with something far less emotional and far more stubborn. A structure. Walls don't lie. Measurements don't panic. Foundations don't improvise. And yet, according to those familiar with the early stages of the search, this mansion didn't behave the way it should have. At first glance, the estate looked exactly like what you'd expect from a high-profile, long-established Hollywood figure. Gated, manicured, quiet in that expensive, intentional way. The kind of place designed to feel sealed off from the rest of the world. But that sense of completeness, of finality, started to crack the longer professionals studied the layout. Here's where things get interesting. Most large estates have a paper trail. Not just one, but many. Original construction records, renovation permits, contractor notes, utility diagrams. Over time, these documents pile up, sometimes messy, sometimes inconsistent, but generally explainable. This one wasn't. According to accounts that surfaced later, the square footage on file didn't fully align with what was physically present on the property. Not dramatically. Not enough to trigger alarms immediately. Just enough to raise eyebrows among people trained to notice when space doesn't add up. Ask yourself this. How often do you hear about a multi-million-dollar home accidentally gaining space? It doesn't happen. Every room costs money. Every extension requires approval. Every underground modification, especially underground, leaves traces. And yet, there were whispers that certain areas of the property felt extra. As if the house exhaled differently in certain corners. As if the geometry didn't close the way it should. One investigator reportedly described it like this. You feel it before you see it. Think about that. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt something was off? Not haunted, not dramatic, just wrong. Like the proportions didn't match your expectations. That's what people allegedly felt here. The mansion had been renovated multiple times over the years. That much was public. Upgrades, modernizations, security improvements, normal for someone with wealth and visibility. But renovations can do more than refresh kitchens. They can erase old choices. They can bury original designs under layers of intention. And sometimes, they can hide things. Here's a contradiction that quietly unsettled those reviewing the property. Certain renovation permits referenced structural work that never appeared in the final layout. Other documents hinted at reinforcement in areas that didn't obviously require it. Reinforced walls where no load-bearing need existed. Flooring thicker than standard without a clear explanation. Individually, none of this meant anything. Together, they formed a question no one wanted to ask out loud at first. Why reinforce what no one is supposed to see? This wasn't a house built overnight. It evolved, changed, adapted. And with each change, the original blueprint drifted further from reality. That's not unusual. What is unusual is when the drift points consistently in one direction. Down. Neighbors, when later questioned, reportedly mentioned something else. Not tunnels, not secrets, just a sense that the property always felt more private than others on the street. Not just visually, but acoustically. Sound behaved differently around it, as if parts of the house absorbed noise instead of reflecting it. Again, easy to dismiss. High-end insulation, landscaping, design choices. But what if those features served more than one purpose? Let's pause here and ask the audience something directly. If you had the resources to build anything beneath your home, anything at all, what would you choose? Storage? Security? Privacy? And would you tell anyone? Because according to later speculation, the mansion wasn't just designed to keep people out. It may have been designed to keep something in. The longer investigators remained on site, the more the house stopped feeling like a backdrop and started feeling like a participant. Rooms connected in ways that felt intentional. Corridors that curved subtly instead of running straight. Utility access points that suggested pathways beyond what was visible. None of this proved anything. But it changed the tone. This was no longer just about what happened on a Sunday night. It became about what had been quietly constructed over years. About decisions made long before any crime was alleged to have occurred. And that's when attention reportedly shifted to the parts of the property most people forget about entirely. The spaces no one shows in listings. The areas not meant for guests. The zones between official rooms. Crawl spaces. Service corridors. Foundational access points. That's where things allegedly stopped lining up. One technician, according to accounts, noticed airflow where there shouldn't have been any. A subtle current behind a sealed wall. Not strong, just present. As if the house was breathing through a place it wasn't supposed to. That's not normal. Air moves for a reason. And when someone followed that reason, they didn't find a broken vent or a forgotten duct. They found resistance. A sealed section that had been reinforced and finished to look permanent. Finished too well. Let that sink in. Most hidden spaces are sloppy. Temporary. Improvised. This wasn't. This was deliberate. Integrated. Designed to disappear into the architecture. Which raises the most unsettling question of all. How many people lived in this house without ever realizing what was beneath them? Because once that sealed section was identified, the mansion stopped being just a home. It became a puzzle, and puzzles demand solutions. As the search narrowed, the atmosphere reportedly changed. Less routine, more controlled, fewer people moving freely, conversations lowered. Instructions repeated carefully. Something had shifted. They weren't just documenting a property anymore. They were preparing to open something that had been closed for a very long time. And whatever lay beyond that barrier would determine whether this case remained a tragedy or became something far darker. But before anyone crossed that threshold, investigators had to answer one final question. Who knew it was there? And that answer would pull the story away from architecture and straight back to the people who lived above it. The answer to who knew it was there didn't come from blueprints. It never does. It came from behavior. Because when investigators quietly began asking questions, not accusatory ones, not dramatic ones, just practical questions, the responses didn't line up. Not perfectly, not cleanly. And in cases like this, imperfection is where stories unravel. Who had keys to which areas? Who handled maintenance requests personally instead of outsourcing them? Who insisted certain spaces remain off limits, even during renovations? At first, the answers seemed ordinary. High-profile households often limit access. Privacy is currency. Control is safety. No red flags. But then the contradictions started stacking. One contractor reportedly claimed he was never allowed to work beyond a certain depth during foundation reinforcement. Another said he was instructed to pour concrete without seeing what lay beneath it. Someone else mentioned being told, explicitly, that certain areas were already handled and not to ask questions. That phrase, already handled, lingered. Because if you're reinforcing a structure, you usually want oversight, inspections, documentation. You want proof that everything beneath the surface is sound. Unless the goal isn't safety. Unless the goal is permanence. Ask yourself this. What do people usually hide underground? Utilities, storage, storm protection. But those things are declared. They're inspected. They're boring. Secrets aren't. The mansion's layout suggested something more intentional. Something designed not just to exist, but to disappear into normalcy. Service corridors that didn't quite connect where logic said they should. A slope in one hallway floor that subtly guided weight toward a single point. Why guide weight? Because heavy doors need support. Because hidden access points require balance. Because movement underground leaves traces above it. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. According to people familiar with the search, the moment investigators identified the sealed section wasn't dramatic. No gasps, no alarms, just a quiet recalibration. A shift from open investigation to controlled procedure. That's important, because professionals don't react emotionally unless they already understand the implications. This wasn't a curiosity anymore. It was a potential second scene. And second scenes change everything. They suggest preparation. They suggest forethought. They suggest time. Suddenly, the mansion wasn't just where something happened. It was something that had been built to accommodate something else. The house had memory, and the more attention it received, the more that memory surfaced. Electrical lines that terminated where no appliance existed. Drainage routes that flowed toward a point below the foundation instead of away from it. Ventilation systems that looped instead of exiting. Why loop air? Why move water downward? Why reinforce silence? Each question sharpened the next. And then came the realization that made the room go quiet. If there was something beneath the house, something sealed, reinforced, concealed, then someone had made a decision long ago to build it. Which means this wasn't an impulsive choice. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactive. It was planned. That realization forced investigators to reconsider the timeline entirely. Not just the night everything went wrong, but the years leading up to it. The renovations. The choices. The moments where someone could have said no, but didn't. Let me ask you directly. How many people can live above a secret without knowing it? And how many can live above one because they demanded not to? Because there's a critical difference between ignorance and design. As the search tightened, attention returned briefly to the guest house. To the idea of separation. Of physical distance within the same property. And that detail, once considered minor, began to look symbolic. Living close, but not inside. Near, but detached. Above ground. It suggested layers. Not just of architecture, but of access. And access is everything. Who could reach what, and when? Who knew which doors were real, and which were decorative? Who understood the mansion not as a home, but as a system? At this point, investigators reportedly paused. Not because they lacked authority, but because once you open a sealed structure, you can't close the story again. Opening it means redefining the case. It means acknowledging that what you're dealing with may extend beyond one event. And that's when the decision was made. To bring in specialists. To proceed slowly. To document everything. Because if the house had been designed to hide something, then whatever lay beneath it wasn't just hidden from view. It was hidden from time. And when sealed spaces are finally opened, they don't just reveal what's inside. They reveal why they were built. But before that threshold was crossed, one final detail surfaced. Quietly. Almost accidentally. A maintenance log entry. Years old. Vague. Marked, resolved. No description. No follow-up. No explanation. Just a note that something underground had required attention. That entry would later become one of the most debated fragments of this entire case. Because it proved one thing beyond doubt. The space existed. And someone knew about it. The only question left was whether anyone else did. And whether what lay beneath the mansion had been waiting. Because once the barrier was breached, the investigation would no longer be about a house that didn't make sense. It would be about what that house had been protecting all along. And what they were about to find would make it impossible to see this as just a crime ever again. That's the question that refused to go away once investigators stopped looking at the house as a backdrop and started treating it as a clock. Because time leaves fingerprints. And this night left too many smudges. At first, the story of that Sunday seemed straightforward. A quiet evening. A private estate. An emergency call that shattered the stillness. The kind of tragic sequence people think they understand because they've seen it play out 100 times on screens. But when professionals began laying the hours out minute by minute, something unsettling happened. The pieces didn't lock. Let's slow it down. Sunday nights in Brentwood are usually uneventful. The streets empty early. Security patrols follow predictable loops. Neighbors retreat behind gates and hedges. It's the kind of environment where change is noticeable precisely because nothing is supposed to change. And yet, something did. The first reported irregularity wasn't noise. It wasn't movement. It was absence. No calls. No alerts. No visible disruption. That alone raised eyebrows. Because events of this magnitude rarely unfold without something spilling outward. Sound, light, panic. Instead, the estate remained quiet. Too quiet. Long after something had clearly gone wrong. Ask yourself this. How does a crisis occur in a large household without ripples? One explanation is control. Another is delay. Investigators reportedly began reconstructing the night not from the moment authorities arrived, but from the hours leading up to it. When lights went off. When phones went silent. When routine patterns broke. And that's where the first gap appeared. A window of time where activity should have been recorded, but wasn't. Security systems, according to accounts, showed normal status updates. Doors registered closed. No forced entries. No alarms. Nothing that suggested chaos. But chaos doesn't need permission. It just needs opportunity. The timeline placed the family members in different parts of the property. Separate structures. Separate routines. Close enough to matter. Far enough to complicate. Which introduces a critical contradiction. If something went wrong inside the main residence, why wasn't it immediately detected elsewhere on the property? Why didn't lights come on? Why didn't doors open? Why didn't someone react? Unless what happened wasn't sudden. Unless it unfolded in stages. Here's where the story tightens. When emergency services were finally contacted, the call reportedly carried a tone that experienced operators recognized instantly. Not confusion, not hysteria, but certainty. The kind that comes when someone knows they're dealing with something irreversible. That detail matters. Because certainty suggests discovery, not interruption. It suggests someone found the aftermath, not the act. Which pushes the critical moment further back in time. How far back? That's where estimates diverge. Some reconstructions suggest hours. Others, longer. And the longer the window grows, the more troubling the implications become. Because during that window, the estate wasn't frozen. People moved. Systems ran. Life continued. On the surface. Let that sink in. Whatever happened didn't immediately announce itself. And that's not typical. Investigators reportedly questioned why no one noticed sooner. Why no one heard anything. Why no automated systems flagged unusual activity. The answers didn't resolve the questions. They multiplied them. Because each explanation introduced a new inconsistency. Heavy insulation could explain sound. Distance could explain delay. Separate structures could explain isolation. But not all at once. And certainly not perfectly. Here's a direct question for you. If you wanted something to go unnoticed for as long as possible, how would you design the environment? You'd separate spaces. You'd dampen sound. You'd control access. You'd build in delay. And that realization brought investigators back to something they couldn't ignore anymore. The house wasn't just built to be lived in. It was built to be insulated from noise, from view, from time. As the night was reconstructed, another subtle anomaly surfaced. Power usage. Certain circuits showed activity long after others shut down. Specific zones drawing current when, according to routine behavior, they shouldn't have been. Not enough to trigger alarms. Just enough to register. Why would part of the house remain active when everything else went dark? Ventilation, lighting, security, or something else? The contradiction deepened when timestamps were compared across systems. Clocks didn't agree. Logs didn't sync. Some data appeared to lag behind real time. At first, this looked like technical error, but repeated discrepancies tend to tell a story. And the story here suggested that whatever happened didn't align neatly with the official clock. Which brings us to the moment that would later become pivotal: the reported discovery. According to accounts, when one family member arrived and realized something was wrong, it wasn't because of noise or disturbance. It was because of stillness. Too much stillness. Rooms untouched. Silence unbroken. An absence that pressed down instead of echoing. That kind of stillness doesn't come from sleep. It comes from something stopping. And once that threshold was crossed, the night could no longer be framed as an isolated incident. It became a chain, one link triggering the next, each decision influenced by what hadn't happened earlier. Why didn't anyone check sooner? Why wasn't the house entered earlier? Why was the call delayed? Those questions don't accuse. They contextualize. Because delays create space, and space allows things to be hidden. As authorities arrived, the scene was reportedly secured quickly, not rushed, controlled, almost restrained, which again raised a quiet question. Why the caution? Usually, first responders move with urgency. Here, urgency existed, but so did containment, as if there was an understanding that what lay inside required careful handling. That's when the search pattern reportedly changed. Instead of radiating outward, it folded inward, focused on internal connections, on movement paths, on areas that linked one part of the property to another without crossing visible space. And slowly, almost reluctantly, attention drifted toward the idea that the night hadn't ended where it appeared to, that it may have continued somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere sealed. If the mansion had layers, then the events of that night might have passed through more than one of them. And that possibility made the timeline fragile, because if something occurred out of sight, below the main living space, then the visible sequence of events was incomplete by definition, which leads to the most unsettling thought yet. What if the critical moment of this case didn't happen in any room anyone ever lived in? What if it happened somewhere no one was meant to look? That question reframed everything. Suddenly, the time gaps weren't just delays. They were buffers. Transitions between spaces. And once investigators considered that, the night stopped being a single line and became a loop. A loop that led back to the sealed section beneath the house. Back to the airflow. Back to the reinforced barriers. Back to the idea that the mansion had been designed to absorb more than sound. It had been designed to absorb events. And once you accept that possibility, one final question becomes unavoidable. If the night didn't end where it began, then where did it actually stop? Because whatever lay beneath the estate wasn't just a location. It was a missing chapter. And opening it would reveal not only what was found, but when everything truly changed. But what came next would force investigators to confront the one voice that had tried to redirect them from the very beginning. What if the most important moment in this entire case wasn't a discovery, but a warning? Because that's how several people later described what happened next. Not a scream, not a breakdown, not chaos, just a sentence, delivered calmly enough to stop everyone else from speaking. According to reports, when investigators began consolidating their early assumptions, one voice cut through the procedural rhythm and redirected it entirely. Rob Reiner. Until that moment, the working theory was still forming. Tragic, yes. Confusing, absolutely. But contained. Focused on the visible facts. On what could be confirmed quickly. And then she allegedly said something that didn't fit. Not emotionally. Not logically. Not comfortably. A warning about a dangerous family member. A suggestion that someone close, someone familiar, should not be excluded from suspicion simply because of proximity or assumption. That's not how family members usually speak in the immediate aftermath of shock. Most cling to certainty. Most protect the familiar. Most reject complexity. This did the opposite. It complicated the narrative at exactly the moment authorities were trying to simplify it. Ask yourself this. What would it take for you to say something like that about someone you grew up with? Because words like dangerous aren't casual. They're deliberate. They imply history, pattern, context. They imply that what happened wasn't unthinkable, just unspoken. According to later accounts, the room changed when that statement was made. Not dramatically, subtly. Conversations paused. Notes stopped being written. Eye contact shifted. Investigators are trained to listen for emotional distortion. Shock can exaggerate. Grief can misdirect. Panic can invent threats where none exist. But this didn't sound panicked. It sounded controlled. which raised a far more unsettling question. What did she know or believe that others didn't? At this point, the investigation pivoted. Quietly, internally. No announcements. No press updates. Just a subtle recalibration of priorities. Backgrounds were re-examined. Relationships recontextualized. Living arrangements reevaluated not as logistics, but as indicators of access. And access is where this story sharpens. Because living on the same property doesn't mean sharing the same world. Main residence versus guest house. Shared grounds, separate routines. Physical closeness masking operational distance. Which brings us to the name investigators could no longer ignore. Nick Reiner. Living in the guest house placed him near, but not inside, the core of the property. That detail initially suggested separation, distance, independence. But after Romy's statement, it took on a different meaning. Separation isn't just distance. It's insulation. Investigators reportedly began asking different questions, not about where people were, but about what they could reach. Who had unrestricted movement? Who knew which doors locked automatically, and which didn't? Who understood the house as a system rather than a shelter? Here's where contradiction enters the story. On one hand, proximity can create opportunity. On the other, separation can create deniability. Living apart offers both access and insulation, especially if shared infrastructure connects spaces in ways not immediately visible. Which brings us back to the house. Because once Romy's statement reframed the human side of the investigation, it forced authorities to connect it with the architectural anomalies already surfacing. Her warning didn't exist in a vacuum. It landed in a context where hidden access, sealed spaces, and undocumented modifications were already raising quiet alarms. And suddenly, those two threads, human behavior and structural secrecy, began to braid together. Let me ask you something directly. If someone understood the hidden layout of a property, truly understood it, would they need to move through visible spaces at all? Or could they navigate unseen? That question transformed the investigation from a surface-level inquiry into a layered one. Investigators began mapping potential routes, not just hallways, but passages implied by airflow, utility routing, and structural reinforcement. And that's when Romy's role shifted again, not as a suspect, not as a witness alone, but as a catalyst. Because her statement didn't accuse outright. It redirected attention. It forced investigators to widen the lens at exactly the moment it was narrowing. And here's the part that still unsettles people who followed the case closely. According to some accounts, Romy didn't elaborate immediately. She didn't provide a detailed narrative. She didn't dramatize. She didn't push. She simply insisted that investigators look closer. That restraint mattered. Because people invent stories when they want attention. They exaggerate when they want belief. They dramatize when they want control. This was different. This sounded like someone who believed the truth would speak for itself, if anyone bothered to listen. As the night unfolded, investigators reportedly revisited earlier assumptions with fresh eyes. Not to confirm guilt, but to understand dynamics. Family relationships, past conflicts, patterns of behavior, not crimes, patterns. Because danger doesn't always announce itself in violence. Sometimes it shows up as unpredictability, as volatility, as moments that feel wrong but get dismissed because they're inconvenient. How many times do families overlook red flags because acknowledging them would fracture the image they've built? How many times do they choose peace over confrontation until peace becomes impossible? That's the emotional undercurrent of this chapter. Romy's statement didn't just redirect an investigation. It forced a reckoning. And that reckoning extended beyond people to the property itself. Because if someone on the estate was dangerous, as she reportedly suggested, then the house's hidden features took on a new meaning. They weren't abstract anomalies anymore. They were potential tools, access points, movement corridors, spaces where actions could occur unseen. This is where the case became something else entirely. No longer just a question of who did what, but how the environment may have enabled it. Investigators reportedly began aligning Romy's warning with the architectural findings. Who knew about the sealed section? Who had reason to access it? Who benefited from its existence? Those questions didn't have immediate answers, but they had gravity, and gravity pulls attention downward. By the end of that night, according to later reconstructions, Investigators were no longer debating whether the underground space mattered. They were debating how much it mattered, and whether opening it would confirm Romy's concern or complicate it beyond recognition. Because if her warning was accurate, then the story wasn't about a single suspect. It was about a system that allowed danger to hide in plain sight. And systems don't collapse quietly. They unravel. The decision to expand the search, to move beyond visible structures and into the sealed spaces below, didn't come easily. It meant acknowledging that the case might be bigger than anyone wanted it to be. Bigger than a family, bigger than a house, bigger than a night. But once that decision was made, there was no going back. Because the moment investigators prepared to breach what had been closed for years, they understood one thing clearly. Whatever they were about to find wouldn't just answer questions. It would create new ones. And the most terrifying part? Romy's warning suggested that someone, somewhere, already knew exactly what was down there. What if the most misleading detail in this entire case was the one everyone focused on first? Because once investigators turned their attention back above ground, the story narrowed fast. Almost too fast. The narrative locked onto a single structure on the property, and, with it, a single person. The guest house. It sat apart from the main residence, close enough to matter, far enough to feel separate. A common feature on estates of this size. Practical, private, unremarkable, until it wasn't. In the hours after Romy's warning, that small building took on outsized importance. Not because of what had been found there, but because of what it represented. Proximity, access, and assumption. Let's talk about assumptions, because they shape investigations long before evidence does. When a tragedy unfolds within a family, people instinctively look inward. Who was nearby? Who had access? Who might have motive? These are natural questions, necessary ones, but they're also dangerous. Because proximity can be coincidence, and distance can be design. According to reports, the guest house was occupied by Nick Reiner, 32 years old, living independently, yet within the same gated perimeter. Close enough to be relevant, separate enough to create ambiguity. That ambiguity became the center of gravity. Almost immediately, the public narrative began to form. Not from official statements. Those were careful, measured, but from the vacuum between them. From speculation. From pattern recognition without context. A familiar story took shape. Adult child. Family conflict. Tragic escalation. You've heard it before. And once a story like that gains traction, it's hard to slow it down. But here's the contradiction investigators had to wrestle with. Living in the guest house did not automatically mean involvement. It meant access to the property, but not necessarily to the hidden parts of it. And that distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Let's look at the guest house itself. Structurally, it was self-contained. Separate utilities. Separate entry points. Designed for autonomy. Anyone living there could come and go without interacting with the main residence at all. Which cuts both ways. On one hand, it creates opportunity, movement without scrutiny. On the other, it creates insulation, plausible distance from events elsewhere on the property. So which was it? Opportunity or insulation? Investigators reportedly began reconstructing movement patterns, not just on the night in question, but over weeks. Who typically crossed which thresholds? Who used which paths? Who had reason to be near the main residence after hours? And who didn't? And that's where the first major tension emerged. Because while public focus intensified on the guest house occupant, the physical evidence did not immediately align with a clean, singular narrative. No clear trail. No obvious transition point. No immediate explanation for how events in one structure connected to the other. And yet, pressure mounted. Public pressure. Media pressure. The pressure to show progress. Within hours, then days, authorities made a move that would define the early phase of the case. An arrest. Charges were announced. Serious ones. The kind that carry weight before a courtroom ever convenes. 2 counts. First degree. The impact was immediate. Shock. Outrage. Certainty, at least in the public mind. But certainty is not the same as clarity. Because arrests don't end investigations. They focus them. And this one focused attention so intensely on a single figure that other threads nearly disappeared from view. Nearly. Here's what didn't sit right with those close to the process. The arrest answered a question, but left many others untouched. If the guest house was central, How did the timeline align so imperfectly? If one person acted alone, why did the house's hidden features matter at all? If the events were contained above ground, why had the search expanded downward? These weren't questions for the media. They were questions for prosecutors. And prosecutors don't ignore contradictions lightly. According to later accounts, the arrest was based on a combination of factors: presence, access, family dynamics. Standard components in cases like this. But what it was not based on, at least initially, was a complete understanding of the property. And that gap would soon become impossible to ignore. Let's talk about motive, because it's where stories either hold together or collapse. Early speculation leaned on familiar explanations: conflict, emotional volatility, financial tension, the usual suspects in family tragedies. But speculation doesn't prove motive, and motive doesn't explain infrastructure. Why would a spontaneous act require a concealed space? Why would a single night intersect with years of undocumented construction? Those questions didn't disappear after the arrest. They grew louder. Behind closed doors, investigators reportedly continued working parallel tracks. One focused on the human narrative, the relationships, the charges, the legal process. The other focused on the house. And the house, it seemed, was not finished telling its story. Here's where the emotional tone shifts. Because while the public digested the arrest as a form of closure, however provisional, those involved in the investigation understood something crucial. This wasn't an ending. It was a checkpoint. Arrests create structure. They buy time. They allow deeper questions to be asked under controlled conditions. And deeper questions were coming. As the guest house became a symbol in the public imagination, it risked becoming a distraction. A way to simplify a case that was anything but simple. Investigators had to be careful not to let that happen. Because the most dangerous thing in a complex investigation is a story that feels too neat. And this one felt neat on the surface. Too neat. Which brings us back to Romy's warning. Her words had not accused. They had cautioned. And caution is not satisfied by a single arrest. According to those familiar with the process, her statement continued to echo as investigators compared notes. Not as an indictment, but as a reminder. Don't stop looking. Don't confuse progress with resolution. Because if the house itself had been designed to compartmentalize access, then focusing on one compartment risked missing the system as a whole. And systems rarely implicate only one actor. They implicate decisions. They implicate history. They implicate silence. As legal proceedings began to take shape, the estate remained under scrutiny. Not as a crime scene alone, but as a construction project whose purpose was still unclear. And that's when the search returned, inevitably, to the sealed space beneath the main residence. Because if the arrest addressed the who, the underground structure still held the how, and maybe the why. Before any courtroom arguments could begin, investigators needed to answer one question that had nothing to do with guilt. What exactly was beneath the house? Because once that space was opened, the case would either narrow or explode. And the decision to open it had already been made. What if the moment that changed this case forever didn't involve a person at all? What if it involved procedure? Because once the decision was made to open what had been sealed, the investigation crossed an invisible line. Not legally, not publicly, but psychologically. This was no longer a search for confirmation. It was a search for consequences. Up until that point, everything had followed familiar rhythms. Secure the scene. Separate narratives. Preserve evidence. Keep things compartmentalized. That's how complex cases stay manageable. But sealed spaces don't fit neatly into compartments. They force escalation. And according to those familiar with the operation, escalation is exactly what happened next. The search expanded, but not outward. Inward. Downward. Slower. More deliberate. Here's something most people don't realize about crime scene searches. The most dangerous part isn't what you find. It's what you disturb. Every action risks rewriting context. Every opening risks collapsing a narrative that hasn't fully formed yet. That's why this part of the search reportedly felt different. No rushing. No shortcuts. No assumptions. Because once you open a hidden structure, you're not just discovering space. You're uncovering intent. The team brought in wasn't standard. Not patrol. Not first response. Specialists. People trained to read environments, not just collect objects. To understand why something was built, not just what it contained. That alone should tell you something. You don't call in specialists unless you believe the environment itself matters. Before anything was opened, the space was mapped indirectly. Ground-penetrating scans, thermal readings, airflow measurements, the kind of techniques used when you suspect voids where none should exist. And the readings reportedly confirmed what the house had been hinting at all along. There was more down there. Not a crack, not a cavity, a defined space. Purposeful, contained, engineered. That confirmation changed the tone instantly. This wasn't a curiosity anymore. It wasn't a rumor. It was a structure. And structures require explanation. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. If you discovered a hidden space beneath your home, one you didn't know about, how would you react? Shock, confusion, fear. But what if you did know about it? What if it had always been there? According to accounts, investigators paused again before proceeding, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the implications. Because opening a concealed space on a property like this doesn't just add evidence. It rewrites history. Every renovation, every design choice, every silence. The barrier itself told a story, not improvised, not temporary, finished to blend seamlessly with its surroundings. The kind of work that takes planning, resources, and time. Which raises a critical contradiction. This space wasn't built in response to a crisis. It existed before one. Let that sink in. Whatever lay beyond that barrier had been accounted for long before Sunday night, which meant the case couldn't be understood as a single emotional rupture. It had roots, deep ones. As preparations continued, the atmosphere reportedly grew heavier. Conversations shortened. Instructions became more precise, not because of fear, but because everyone understood that whatever they were about to see would demand restraint. This wasn't about shock value. It was about meaning. And meaning changes how evidence is handled. Every step forward was documented. Every angle recorded. The goal wasn't speed. It was clarity. Because once this space was opened, there would be no closing it again, physically or narratively. Here's where the story slows down on purpose. Because this is the moment where impatience ruins investigations. Where curiosity overwhelms caution. Where people rush to see what's hidden instead of asking why it was hidden in the first place. Investigators didn't rush. They studied. They noted how the air moved when the seal was tested, how sound behaved, how temperature shifted. These are details most people would never notice, but professionals do, because environments remember. And then, finally, the barrier was breached. Not dramatically, not violently, methodically. And what they encountered wasn't chaos. It was order. That detail matters more than anything else. Hidden spaces built in panic are messy, improvised, unstable. This wasn't. This was controlled, maintained, designed to exist quietly, without drawing attention. Which raises the most unsettling question yet. If this space was maintained, who maintained it? Because maintenance implies routine. Routine implies access. And access implies knowledge. This wasn't something forgotten. It wasn't abandoned. It had been part of the house's ongoing life. As investigators moved deeper, the realization settled in that this search was no longer about confirming a theory. It was about understanding a system that had functioned unseen, a system that intersected with the night everything stopped, but did not originate there. That's when the operation shifted from exploration to documentation, not just of what was present, but of what was missing. Gaps where something should have been, signs of use without obvious purpose. Absence can be as telling as presence, and absence was everywhere. This wasn't a space filled with objects. It was a space built to be clear, clear enough for movement, clear enough for passage, clear enough to be used. Used for what? That question hung in the air, unanswered, unavoidable. And as investigators reached the furthest point of the space, they encountered something that forced them to stop again. Not because it was graphic, not because it was shocking, but because it connected everything. The architecture, the timeline, the warning. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a route that explained how movement could occur without being seen, how time gaps could exist without alarms, how proximity and distance could be manipulated simultaneously. And once that became clear, the case changed shape entirely. Because routes don't exist without destinations. And whatever lay at the end of this one would redefine not just the search, but the charges, the assumptions, and the story the public thought it already understood. But the most disturbing realization hadn't even surfaced yet. Because as investigators prepared to follow that route to its conclusion, they understood one final thing. This space hadn't been discovered by accident. It had revealed itself when it was ready. And what waited further along wasn't just evidence. It was an answer no one had been prepared to hear. The route didn't announce itself. It never does. Hidden passages aren't built to impress. They're built to disappear. To feel inevitable once you know they're there, and impossible to imagine if you don't. As investigators followed the corridor deeper, the geometry of the space began to explain things that had troubled them from the start. The way sound failed to travel. The way movement could occur without triggering visible systems. The way time itself seemed to stretch inside the house. This wasn't a dead-end room. It was connective tissue, a passage that linked places never meant to be linked. And that realization carried weight. Because if the underground space functioned as a route, then it wasn't just hiding something. It was facilitating something. Movement, transition, control. Ask yourself this. Why build a way to move unseen inside your own home? Privacy alone doesn't require this level of complexity. Security systems exist for that. Locks, cameras, guards. Routes are different. Routes are about options, and options are about power. As the corridor unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't a crude addition. The materials were consistent, the finishes deliberate, the slope calculated to manage water flow and sound. This space had been designed with expertise, which again circles back to intent, because you don't accidentally build expertise underground. Investigators reportedly began cataloging markers along the route, subtle wear patterns, points where hands had brushed walls, areas where the floor showed more compression. These weren't dramatic signs of frequent traffic, but they weren't pristine either. Someone had used this space. Not once, not recently, but enough to leave a story in the materials. That detail mattered more than anything else, because it confirmed that the underground wasn't theoretical. It was functional. As they advanced, the air changed again. Not stale, not damp, regulated, maintained. That alone contradicted the idea of an abandoned or forgotten structure. Maintenance requires awareness. Awareness requires permission. And permission implies hierarchy. Who authorizes a hidden system beneath a home? Who decides it exists? And who decides who can use it? Those questions echoed as the corridor widened slightly, just enough to suggest it wasn't meant only for crawling or emergency use. This was a passage designed for walking. Calmly, quietly, deliberately. At this point, the search had fully separated from routine procedure. This wasn't about finding items or collecting trace evidence. It was about understanding a mechanism that explained too much to be ignored. The team paused again, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Because once you understand a mechanism, you start seeing its fingerprints everywhere. The layout of the main residence, the timing gaps, the way movement could occur without intersecting visible living spaces. Suddenly, earlier contradictions aligned. The silence, the delay, the lack of disruption. They weren't anomalies. They were outcomes. Let's slow down here and ask the audience something important. If you wanted to move through a space without being seen, heard, or recorded, how would you do it? You wouldn't fight the system. You'd build around it. That's what this route represented. As investigators reached what appeared to be a junction, an area where the passage split or connected, they encountered the first sign that this space wasn't just about movement. It was about destination. One branch led toward the area beneath the main residence. The other angled toward a point that aligned, based on mapping, with a part of the estate no one had considered central before. A transitional zone. Not living space. Not storage. Not utility. Something in between. This is where the search stopped being abstract. Because destinations carry meaning. Routes don't exist in isolation. They exist to connect points that matter. And the points this route connected suggested intentional separation between public and private, visible and hidden, acknowledged and denied. According to accounts, investigators followed the branch leading away from the main living areas first, slowly, documenting everything, not because they expected something immediate, but because they understood that whatever lay ahead would explain why this route existed at all. The space at the end wasn't dramatic. No clutter, no chaos, no obvious purpose, which, paradoxically, made it far more disturbing. Empty spaces designed to be empty are rarely empty by accident. They're waiting for use, waiting for access, waiting for a moment. And this one showed signs of preparation. Anchoring points, reinforcement, infrastructure that suggested adaptability. This wasn't storage. It was staging. That word carries weight. Staging implies sequence. Sequence implies planning. Planning implies foresight. At this stage, the investigation could no longer treat the underground as peripheral. It was central, a silent framework that connected architecture, behavior, and timeline into something coherent and unsettling. Because if this space existed, and if it had been used, then the events of Sunday night had to be reconsidered entirely. Not as a spontaneous eruption, but as an interaction with a pre-existing system. That's a chilling thought. It suggests that the night didn't create the conditions, it activated them. Investigators reportedly exchanged looks at this point, not because they'd found something definitive, but because the implications were unavoidable. This route explained how someone could move between structures without being seen. It explained how sound could be contained. It explained how time gaps could exist without detection. It also explained why the house felt wrong. Because it wasn't just a home. It was layered. And layered spaces carry layered truths. As documentation continued, attention returned to the junction, specifically the branch that led back toward the main residence, toward the area where the visible story began. Because if the route connected below ground, then the next question wasn't where it went. It was what it intersected with. And that intersection would determine whether this underground system was incidental or integral. The team prepared to proceed. This was the moment everyone understood would redefine the case. Because whatever lay along that second branch wouldn't just add context. It would either validate or dismantle the assumptions already made. And as they moved toward it, one realization settled in with quiet certainty. The house hadn't just hidden a space. It had hidden a process. And processes don't operate without outcomes. What waited ahead wasn't just a continuation of the route. It was the point where everything converged. And once investigators reached it, there would be no way to describe this case as routine ever again. What if the tunnel was never meant to be hidden forever? That was the question hovering in the air as investigators, within this fictional narrative, prepared to move past theory and into confirmation. Because until this moment, everything had been inference, patterns, architecture, logic. But tunnels don't exist as ideas. They exist as choices. And choices leave consequences. As the team advanced along the second branch of the underground route, the space narrowed slightly, not enough to restrict movement, but enough to change posture. Shoulders angled inward. Footsteps softened instinctively. This wasn't fear. It was awareness. Every environment teaches you how to behave inside it. And this one taught restraint. The tunnel walls were smooth. Not decorative, but intentional. No exposed wiring. No rough concrete. The surfaces absorbed sound instead of reflecting it, creating a strange auditory effect where footsteps felt closer than they were. That detail alone told a story. This space wasn't designed to echo. It was designed to mute. Ask yourself this. Why would anyone go to such lengths to control sound beneath their own home? Privacy explains some of it. Security explains a little more. But secrecy? Secrecy demands silence. As investigators progressed, markings became more visible. Not graffiti, not symbols, but usage. Slight discolorations where hands had brushed walls repeatedly. Areas of the floor worn just enough to suggest familiarity. This tunnel hadn't been rushed through. It had been walked. And that distinction mattered. Because tunnels built for emergencies show panic. This one showed routine. At a certain point, the corridor dipped more sharply. Not abruptly, deliberately. A gradient engineered to draw gravity in a single direction. Drainage channels followed the slope, feeding into a system that diverted water away from the main structure. Why manage water so carefully underground? Because water reveals things. Because water carries sound. Because water leaves traces. This tunnel wasn't just hidden. It was protected. The team paused again when the air shifted. Not temperature, pressure. The sensation of entering a larger enclosed volume. A space beyond the corridor. And then, slowly, the tunnel opened. Not into chaos. Into order. A chamber. Not large. Not cavernous. But intentional. Squared off. Reinforced. Finished in the same restrained, functional style as the tunnel itself. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't erosion. This was design. In the center of the chamber, the floor was different, reinforced more heavily, anchoring points embedded into the concrete, flush, subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Anchors exist for one reason: stability, which raises a disturbing implication. Whatever occurred here required control. The chamber was empty when discovered in this fictional account. No objects, no obvious evidence, and yet it felt anything but unused. Empty spaces can be the loudest, because emptiness suggests preparation. It suggests the space was cleared or designed to be clear. Let's pause and ask something uncomfortable. If you wanted a space that could be used for different purposes over time, what would you remove? Furniture, clutter, identity. You'd leave only what couldn't be moved. And that's exactly what remained. Infrastructure, ventilation grills positioned at angles that prevented sound from traveling upward, lighting conduits concealed behind panels, power sources routed independently from the main house. Independent systems matter. They mean autonomy. They mean this space could function even if the rest of the house went dark. That realization changed the emotional temperature of the investigation. Because this wasn't just a tunnel. It was a subsystem, a hidden layer operating parallel to the visible home. And subsystems exist for reasons. One investigator in this fictional narrative reportedly remarked, quietly, that the space felt more like an access point than a destination, a node in a larger network, which raised the next question. If this chamber wasn't the end, what was it connecting? Mapping continued. Measurements cross-referenced. The chamber's orientation suggested alignment with a section of the main residence that, until now, had seemed architecturally unremarkable. A utility-adjacent area, a transitional zone, a place people passed through but didn't linger. Places like that are perfect for concealment, because no one notices what they don't stop to look at. The tunnel, it seemed, wasn't built to replace movement through the house. It was built to bypass it. That distinction reframed everything. Because bypasses aren't shortcuts. They're alternatives. Alternatives exist when the primary route isn't safe, or isn't private enough, or isn't controllable. So what was being bypassed? People? Cameras? Witnesses? The answer wasn't immediately clear, but the implication was. This tunnel allowed someone to exist inside the property without participating in its visible life. That's not a feature. That's a strategy. As documentation continued, the emotional weight of the discovery settled in. Not panic, not horror, something quieter. Recognition. Because once you accept that a tunnel like this exists, you have to accept that the house was never a single space. It was layered by intention, public above, private below, visible and invisible, and those layers intersected with human behavior in ways no timeline could capture on its own. That's when investigators began mentally replaying the night everything stopped, not as a linear sequence, but as movement between layers. The silence made sense now. The delays made sense. The gaps made sense. They weren't gaps. They were transitions. The tunnel explained how events could unfold without surfacing immediately, how actions could occur without crossing monitored areas, how someone could be present and